Hi, I'm Bill Milkowski. I'm a longtime contributor to Downbeat Magazine and Jazz Times, Jazz Is. I've been writing about jazz, man, since 1976. That was my first published story. So actually, wait a minute, 74, Return to Forever, Stanley Clarke, Chick Corea. Yeah, so it's been a minute. It's been, what is it, 40? What is the math on that? It's like 100 years. I've been writing about jazz for 100 years. So I wanted to, first of all, pay tribute to the late, great Pat Martino, who just passed on November 1st after a lengthy illness. He hadn't been playing on the scene since November of 2018. I had been in touch with Pat, and recently Joel Harrison and I we co-hosted a guitar tribute to Pat, which was live streamed a few months back, involving many great guitarists: Dave Stryker, Ed Cherry, Cheryl Bailey, Reza Bassi, many others. And Pat was watching at home. And I was happy that I was able to, at the end of it, hold up a glass of Cabernet and give him a salute. Hey, Pat, this is for you. And that was my way of saying hello and goodbye. That was over the summer, and he had been fighting emphysema, which is something he had struggled with all his life, and really was managing it, was playing great up until the end of 2018. And it's just a profoundly sad day to see that he's passed. Of course, he left us with such a rich recorded legacy, and so many people loved him. His playing was one of a kind. George Benson has some hilarious stories about them being rivals on the same scene in Harlem in 1962. Benson was playing with Jack McDuff, and Pat was playing with Willis Gator Tail Jackson at Small's Paradise up in Harlem. And George happened to stop in one night and saw this skinny young Italian kid up on the bandstand killing it with Gator Tail, and right away started fearing for his own job with McDuff. And actually soon after, George did leave McDuff and Pat took that gig. And it was one of many organ gigs that Pat Martino had. He played with some of the great Philly organists. Pat is from South Philly, and he played with Trudy Pitts and Don Patterson and many others, and was steeped in that tradition. So by the time he got to Small's Paradise in 1962, he was already a seasoned vet, even though he was, I think, 20 years old. He had already been on the band bus on the road with Lloyd Price's 18-piece big band, playing with on the bus, on the bandstand, were some veteran cats like Jimmy Heath and Paul Chambers and Charlie Persif, Red Holloway, who later became sort of a mentor of Pat's and was on his first few records as a leader. Pat was 16 on that bus with Lloyd Price. He left home at the age of 16 and struck out on his own, and just his career took off from there. He was an acknowledged, preternaturally gifted guitar player whose trademark was incredibly speedy and cleanly articulated lines, sort of emulating bebop horn players, in the tradition of George Benson and Grant Green, and all of their heroes. Was Wes Montgomery, of course. Pat, he made his first album at the age of 21. Really prescient that he titled it El Hombre, the man, because Pat was the man. and he sure proved it over the course of his career. All of his great recordings with Prestige, and I have this record in the behind me. Whoops, the opposite way. Bayana, The Clear Evidence. This album came out. Pat's first album, El Hombre, came out in May of, or recorded in May of '67. By June of '68, 1 year later, he's doing an album with tablas, tambora, and it's a suite of music inspired by his investigation into the Quran. So dig that. He was a searching, curious cat, somewhat mystical, had one foot in the grease of organ quartets and then another foot striding somewhere else that a lot of people were trying to catch up with. There's a whole series of recordings that Pat did through the '70s, culminating in these really interesting. He did these recordings in the '70s for Prestige and Muse, and they were pretty much in the tradition and showcased his remarkable technique. But in '76, he sort of stuck one toe into the fusion pool in a post Weather Report, Return to Forever, '76. He was signed to Warner Brothers, and he did 2 albums, Starbright and Joyous Lake, that really pushed some boundaries with him playing guitar synth in 1976. This is unheard of. That caught the ears of a lot of people, that recording. And then, of course, as music has a tendency to do, hooked them into going backwards to see what he was about on albums like Strings and East and Desperado and Consciousness. I ended up writing this book with Pat. It came out in 2011. It's Here and Now, the Autobiography of Pat Martino. This was done basically a series of interviews with me taking the bus from Manhattan to Philadelphia, where he lives, South Philly. He was living in the home where he grew up, his parents' home. And his parents had passed at this point. His father, Carmen Mickey Azara, that's Pat's actual real first name, Azara, was his biggest cheerleader and sort of pushed Pat out there to meet and engage with people. Mickey took a few lessons with Eddie Lang, the great guitarist and jazz pioneer who lived in the South Philly neighborhood. And so Mickey Azar was pushing his son from the age of 12 out to bring him down to the barbershop. Hey, listen to my kid play. He's really good, and he'd go up to the bandstand where at a gig where Stan Kenton was playing, Stan Getz, who had done some famous recordings with Johnny Smith, who was one of Pat's idols, along with Wes. And he'd go right up to Stan Getz and say, hey, listen to my kid. He brought his guitar. Why don't you come backstage and listen to him? So Pat was being pushed from an early age into some kind of destiny. In terms of how I collided with Pat, let me read from this book. It's a little passage about my encounter, my interaction, my awareness of Pat. I'll read from this book. And I hope I don't look too stupid looking down, but here it is. Okay, it was Consciousness, the first album. I should show that. Hold on, can I do this? I want to show it what it looks like. Consciousness, hold on. Come on now. Oh, man. Can't find it. But it's a very dramatic and enigmatic cover. I'll have to look for it later. So let me get back to this. Okay, it was Consciousness that first pulled me to Pat Martino. I was 19 years old in that summer of 1974. That's when the album came out on the Muse label. And back then, I spent a lot of my free time perusing the bins at Radio Doctor's record shop in downtown Milwaukee. always on the lookout for new jazz guitar albums. I was coming out of a rock phase of worshiping guitar heroes like Jimi Hendrix, Jeff Beck, Johnny Winter, and Frank Zappa, and was gradually beginning to embrace jazz through such players as Charlie Christian and his direct disciples Herb Ellis, Barney Kessel, and Tiny Grimes. Hearing Joe Pass on Oscar Peterson's 1973 album, The Trio, with bassist Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen, was a major revelation, as was his solo guitar album that came out later that year, Virtuoso. I was primed for someone like Pat Martino. And when I spotted Consciousness in the Bins with its striking black and white photograph of Pat sitting cross-legged on what appeared to be a lily pad, staring directly back at me with an intense Rasputin-like gaze, I was absolutely transfixed. I took it home, dropped the needle, remember that process, on the first track, his blazing rendition of John Coltrane's Impressions, and was instantly blown away. And I've been a Pat Martino devotee ever since. When Pat came out with Joyous Lake in the summer of 1977, it fed right into my fusion inclinations. I had been heavily into the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Weather Report, and Return to Forever during the early 70s. Apart from the incredibly powerful music within, there remained a mystical vibe to this extraordinary guitarist, Pat Martino, as shown in the depiction of his 58th hexagram of the I Ching hovering over his head on the album cover. That particular hexagram not only symbolized the smiling or joyous lake, it stood for perseverance. Little did I know then how much meaning this hexagram would have in Pat's later life. That fall of 1977, I heard that Pat would be performing in Madison, about 90 miles away from my hometown of Milwaukee. I made that pilgrimage with my best friend and fellow guitar enthusiast, Rick Weinman. Determined to see this mystical six-string guru in the flesh, we drove to Wisconsin's capital city to get enlightened. Pat was appearing in a duo there at an intimate restaurant club with fellow Philadelphian Bobby Rose. And as we entered the joint after our 90-minute drive, the two were engaged in a burning rendition of Wes's 4 on 6. We stood in awe of Pat's facility and inventive lines during that set, and afterwards sought him out for a chat. Surprisingly, he was not only approachable and forthcoming, gods rarely are, he invited us back to his hotel room to continue our conversation. What followed was a rather free-flowing esoteric rap that lasted into the wee hours and touched upon aspects of guitar as it relates to sacred geometry, 12-pointed stars, and the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, along with another myriad of other mind-blowing topics. As he said, music is food, the guitar is merely a fork. Things like that were way over my head at the time. I left that encounter inspired and determined to elevate my own game as a novice guitar player. So that was 1977. I ended up moving to New York in 1980 and began seeing a lot of music in earnest, including the music of Michael Brecker, who's the subject of my current book that just came out, Ode to a Tenor Titan, The Life and Times and Music of Michael Brecker. Pat, at the end of the 70s, he had been suffering seizures, and he had a very bad seizure, which required a life-saving surgery to remove an aneurysm, brain aneurysm that he had in late 79. And when he woke up from the surgery, not only did he not recognize the guitar that his father had brought to his room in the hospital, he didn't recognize his parents. He had lost his memory, and thus began a period of trying to recover his memory and his ability to play the guitar. And this led to years of gradual woodshedding, recalling memory, relearning the fretboard, and rebuilding his memories of playing and being who he was, being Pat Martino, that incredible virtuoso. It was a gradual process. It took some years. I remember seeing Pat open for Stanley Clarke at the Bottom Line in 1984. This was a very triumphant homecoming for him after having been off the scene for 4 years. He did some anonymous gigs in the Philly area, including another one that I actually caught earlier at Cape May, where he played at a restaurant under his real name, Pat Azara. It was on the sandwich board outside the restaurant, and I remember going in, and that's Pat Martino. He was making his re-entry back into the public very gradually, starting off by doing these anonymous gigs under his own name, until finally emerging with this gig at the Bottom Line in New York, where he opened for Stanley Clarke. Stanley, of course, embraced Pat and had Pat appear on his very first album. I think it was in '72. So they were Philly pals, and this was a comeback for Pat. He later appeared at Fat Tuesdays in '86, I believe. I went to that gig. I think it was Steve Laspina on bass and Joey Barron on drums. That was recorded and released as The Return. This was heralding Pat's return. It didn't come out till '89. So there was that gap in between his last album in the late '70s and what was it? His first album that came out. I think it was maybe Joyous Lake was '76, and then nothing after that until '89. I could be messing up the dates on this, but The Return came out in '89. Yeah, and so he returned, and he had his facility. It was coming back gradually. He meant, and of course he had great albums since then. I ended up producing a record that he did for Blue Note. It was his first Blue Note album called All Sides Now. Sort of a play on words on the tune Both Sides Now, the Joni Mitchell tune that he had recorded as a solo piece in the '70s on an earlier album. All Sides Now was that was Bruce Lundvall's, the late Bruce Lundvall, his idea at Blue Note, the head of Blue Note Records, to welcome Pat to the label with an all-star celebration featuring a second guitarist on each track, people that worship Pat, pretty much from a younger generation, people that came up admiring and worshiping Pat, like Kevin Eubanks and Michael Hedges, Mike Stern, many others, Charlie Hunter. This was a project that was very difficult for Pat because, being from the old school, he was used to recording an album in a day or two. This process of going all over the country to record with different people, some of whom he had never met, some of whom, as he would explain, if I knew him, I don't remember. A lot of his memory was lost. One of the people that he recorded with was Cassandra Wilson. We did a beautiful duet of Both Sides Now, that great Joni Mitchell tune again. And it was just very compelling. Cassandra, of course, is so dramatic, and they had virtually no rehearsal. And Pat had like woodshedded the tune in E, I think. And when we got to the studio, Cassandra was like, "Oh no, I was expecting it to be in D." So Pat like just dropped his tuning down to D, and they proceeded to knock out this track. It was beautiful. One of the highlights of that album was Pat playing with his mentor and hero, Les Paul, who had actually written the liner notes to Pat's 1970 prestige album, Desperado, um, explaining how in the liner notes he told the story of Pat's father bringing young Pat by. He was 12 at the time, and telling the same thing. My kid's great. You should hear him play. And he played Les's guitar, and Les noted at the time and in the liner notes that Pat had this uncannily precise right-hand picking technique that was extraordinary. And even today, it astounds established players from George Benson to Kevin Eubanks and uh, Dave Stryker and Ed Sheeran's legions of players that worship Pat today. Fareed Haq, man, I could go on and on. Yeah, so this album came out 2011. It sort of solidified my personal relationship with Pat, working with him over the course of a year in different cities. We did tracks with Joe Satriani, who they also wanted to show that Pat's reach went beyond jazz and into a rock realm. That was recorded at Michael Hedges' studio up in Marin County. Michael Hedges and Satriani were recorded there. Um, we did Charlie Hunter's trio with Pat in Los Angeles, or was it San Francisco? No, it was Los Angeles. On and on. Every track was in a different place, kind of challenging for Pat. Again, it was used to knocking it out in one day. But it came out and I thought it was great. He went on to do several brilliant recordings for Blue Note, including the great live at Yoshi's with Joey DeFrancesco and Billy Hart, a killing trio album. And then Pat came full circle back to pay tribute to his North Star, Wes Montgomery, on that great Blue Note album, Remembering, which came out in 2006. A tribute to Wes Montgomery with Dave Kukowski on piano, John Patitucci on bass, Scott Allen Robinson on drums, and Daniel Sadownik on percussion. That was a great album. That was his last Blue Note album. He did a few since then for High Note, and man, like I say, he did. Let me mention this 2003 album, Think Tank, on Blue Note. That was interesting, original music with Joe Lovano, very difficult music. Gonzalo Rubalcaba on piano, Christian McBride on bass, and Lewis Nash on drums. Yeah, he did a few albums on High Note and was touring for the last 8 years with organist Pat Bianchi and drummer Carmen Intore. They had a beautiful trio chemistry. I saw them so many times, and they were touring up until, like I said, November of 2018, when Pat's health took a turn for the worse and he couldn't play anymore. And I was happy to be able to co-host that tribute with Joel Harrison to show Pat how much he was loved and how many people came to play on that. And Kurt Rosenwinkel, who couldn't make it because his own, I think, was it father or stepfather, had passed a couple of days before the gig. It was actually a live gig at a recording studio in downtown Manhattan. Kurt sent in a video of him playing with backing tracks. He loved Pat very much. That was a great evening. I was glad to be able to toast Pat and say salud to him. And again, this was just a series of Me jumping on the bus in Port Authority, taking the bus over to Philly, hanging out in Pat's couch, talking for 4 hours, having a dinner break, going back, talking for 3 more hours, going back home, doing the same thing the next day. We must have had 5 or 6 sessions like that, culminating, in this book, which is written in Pat's voice, um, about his career, his life, his memories of Small's Paradise and Willis Gatortail Jackson, um, and his career, but also the larger issue of Pat seeing his place in the universe as a musician and the role of musicians, and some very inspiring thoughts in this book that he really wanted to get in there. It's more than just a biography. It's initially, when I sat down with Pat to suss out how we were going to do this, he registered the belief that he wanted it to be a self-help book, and not just for musicians, but for humans. And at some point after going through that tragic surgery, really a life-threatening surgery, and coming back from the dead, so to speak, he had a brush with death, and he came to see life in a very different way at that point, and a very larger sense, a far more existential sense than what he was doing when he was the hotshot side man up in Small's Paradise. So this book is filled with kind of Zen Buddhist truisms. The very title itself, Here and Now, reflects a Buddhist nature of be here now. So yeah, it's highly recommended to not only delve further into the career of this great guitarist, but also into his mind and what makes him tick and how he sees the the importance and the function of music in the universe. Dig that, you know. And so, rest in peace, Pat. He was loved by so many, a beloved figure, truly open-minded, searching, generous spirit, and killer player for all time. That description would also fit Michael Brecker, who this book just came out recently. I'd been working on this for 2.5 years. Ode to a Tenor Titan, The Life and Times and Music of Michael Brecker. Again, another preternaturally gifted individual whose incessant woodshedding really brought him to another worldly level in terms of technique on his instrument, the tenor sax. So I explore his life and his pursuit in the shadow of his biggest inspiration, John Coltrane, who we actually saw play live in 1966 as a 16-year-old kid. He saw Train at Temple University perform live, and that music was recorded and much later, fairly recently released by Zev Feldman of Resonance Records as the Live at Temple University concerts. Mike was there, and it changed his life. And he says so in no uncertain terms, put him on a path and gave him not only a path, but a career choice. Randy Brecker in the book, I spoke at length with him, and he mentioned that Randy is 3.5 years older, almost 4 years older. And when he left for Indiana University to pursue music in college, he wasn't sure that Mike was going to pursue music. At that time, Mike was 6'3". He ended up being 6'4.5". And he was equally committed to basketball and music. He played clarinet, sort of half-heartedly, um, but was very into science and had a chemistry set in the basement, and also dug basketball. And Randy mentions at the time he left for college, he had never heard Mike play the saxophone. He heard him play clarinet. Mike began playing alto sax at 16, and then after seeing Train, it sort of was that life-changing event. His teacher at the time noted this inclination to play Trainisms on the alto and quickly switched him to tenor. Vince Trombetta, who is a veteran on the Philadelphia Atlantic City scene, who was also playing in the band on the Mike Douglas show, which is based out of Philadelphia. He was Mike's teacher, and definitely put him on a path to tenor sax. Mike came to New York in 1969. He left Indiana after 3 semesters, came to New York. He had played on his brother Randy's first album as a leader, called Score, which was recorded in 69 and came out in 1970 on the Solid State label, which is the same label that the year before had Chick Corea's Now He Sings, Now He Sobs. That was a very hip label, Solid State. And Mike came in and played on a few tracks, and he was 19 years old. It was his first recording session in Manhattan, and he was playing at Rudy Van Gelder's studio where Train had done all those legendary albums, and he had to be intimidated and frightened, but he killed it, and very soon after became a ubiquitous figure on the loft scene, which was focused pretty much on a particular area on 19th Street in lower Manhattan. A lot of people got lofts for the purpose of jamming around the clock because it wasn't residential. They could play at 3 in the morning or whenever. Dave Liebman was a force on that scene, as was Richie Byrack. Liebman had a loft in a building on 19th Street that was also occupied by Dave Holland on one floor and Chick Corea on another floor. And a lot of the loft jams took place at Liebman's loft. And this was very much free, latter-day Train sort of Ascension and beyond inspired Train material. Often 5 saxes in the room with a drummer and a bass player. And this sort of thing took place in these lofts, and Mike was very much a part of it, was right on that scene. They eventually organized a group called Free Life Communications, which organized, I guess at some point, Liebman and Byrack determined that this was very, where we should be presenting this music we're playing in a public venue. And since it was unlikely that they would be booked at the Vanguard, they just began presenting their own free concerts at Liebman's loft space, and later they acquired a larger, more commercial space, and they were presenting this free music. Mike was a part of that scene. Shortly after, he and Randy were involved with the group Dreams, which was a seminal rock jazz group, sort of at the same time as Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago. Barry Rogers was the trombonist in that group, and between Barry, Mike, and Randy, they put together they really improvised arrangements on the spot behind what was sort of hip rock music of the day with intelligent, socially aware vocals, and fueled by none other than Billy Cobham. Billy and Randy had met and played in Horace Silver's group. When Horace disbanded the group and Dreams was starting up, it sort of came together pretty easily and quickly. with Mike, Randy, Billy, Doug Luban. Uh, Eventually, Will Lee got in that group, John Abercrombie, and they were a very potent force on the scene long before there was a label Fusion. This is like 70, 71. The group kind of broke up because Billy Billy left the band to join the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and they couldn't find a drummer to replace him. No one played like that at the time. He set the template, set that template for that kind of drumming. Obviously, he took it to a different level with Mahavishnu, and you know, later after he left Mahavishnu in '72, he formed his own band and got the Brecker brothers in that band. They played for a couple of years. Mike and Randy then went into Horace's band, along with Alvin Queen on drums and Will Lee on bass. And they were killing in that situation. Mike and Randy got involved big time on the studio scene and they were ubiquitous figures on commercial jingles and many pop albums, rock albums, funk albums, P-Funk, James Brown, James Taylor, Paul Simon, Chaka Khan, on and on. Hundreds, 3 a day. And that led up to them forming the Brecker Brothers in '75, a real breakthrough, pioneering funk jazz group that had a run through the '70s, culminating in the albums Heavy Metal Bebop in '79 and Strap Hanging. And they disbanded. Mike eventually recorded his first album as a leader in '87 at the ripe old age of 38. And of course, he went on to win Grammys and acclaim as a leader, as a composer, all the way through the '80s and into the '90s, until, and was blossoming as a composer and as a force, as a band leader. These beautiful albums like Wide Angles, which was with his quintet featuring a string section and beautiful horns. Man, that really showed off his composing, leaping to another increment in terms of the canvas. The canvas got bigger, his scope got deeper, and that was in 2001 when it was recorded. Sadly, Mike was felled at the peak of his powers and at the highest moment of contentment in his life with his wife and kids, his wife Susan and his 2 kids, Sam and Jessica, living this very beautiful life up in Hastings and Hudson. And at the peak of all that, he was cut down by this terrible disease, MDS, which required a bone marrow transplant to save his life. His manager, Daryl Pitt, and his wife, Susan, engineered a international campaign to find a donor, bone marrow donor, at jazz festivals, at the IAG, AE convention, places all over town. And because Mike had Ashkenazi Jewish DNA, they did a big search in Israel at the Red Sea Festival in Eilat, as well as at Mike's synagogue in his hometown of Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, where he grew up with Randy. And at his synagogue in Hastings-on-Hudson. Ultimately, all he was able to get was a half match from his daughter, Jess. That sort of prolonged his life, gave him the strength to get off a sickbed and make his final incredibly powerful and beautiful swan song, the album Pilgrimage, which was a recording he did. He was sick at the time, but he was strong enough to drive himself into town to the studio in Midtown Manhattan and record this new music he had composed. And it was difficult music. Herbie Hancock, who was on that, was principal on that gig, along with Pat Metheny and John Patitucci, Brad Meldau as well, Gil Goldstein. Herbie said, "Man, this was difficult music," and sort of at the session, Metheny joked, Mike, are you sure you're sick? Because you're killing it, and this is difficult music. Yeah, so that was a beautiful record. It was really represented another incremental leap for Mike as a composer. And very sadly, it came out posthumously. He passed before it was released. And it received 2 Grammy Awards, which Susan accepted posthumously. So me getting into this story was a thing of total immersion in Mike, similarly as it was for me with Pat Martino in 2011, and similarly as it was with the book I did on Jaco Pastorius. This originally came out in 1995. What I'm holding up here is the 10th anniversary edition, which the publishers allowed me to really rewrite the book, go back and fill in blanks and interview people that were too shell-shocked to talk to me the first time around. This 10th anniversary edition is literally twice as long. It's like a new book, especially heavy on the early years of his upbringing in Florida. So when I do these books, it is a thing of total immersion. I was immersed in Jaco when I first endeavored to write that book. I actually began doing that in 1993, when I was still living in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, before it was Williamsburg. Trust me, there was no scene there, and there were packs of wild dogs roving the street at night, looking for French poodles to beat up, and crack gangs firing at each other. This was not the Williamsburg of now. I moved to New Orleans in '93 and finished writing the Jaco book down in New Orleans. It came out almost simultaneous with the birth of my daughter in April 1995. That book and my daughter were 2 births. That was actually my 3rd book, so I had gone through the process before, but it came out in April of '95, and then 10 years later, I reinvestigated this story, filled in so many blanks, talked to people who were still too shell-shocked by Jaco's passing to talk to me the first time around. Got so much revealing testimony that I didn't have the first time around. And went down to Florida and interviewed a lot of his pals who he grew up with, teenagers, and got a much deeper understanding of who Jaco was before he came to New York, which is when I got to know him in the early 80s. So total immersion into Jaco, total immersion into Pat Martino, and now total immersion into Mike Brecker. And the way that came about is I did all the interviews for that book, for the Mike Brecker book. That's a blow up behind me. In 2019, I spent that whole year doing all the interviews. By this time, I had moved. I was living in West Hartford. Oh, after New Orleans, I moved back to New York and was there. Left in 2018 to move to West Hartford. Uh, Began undertaking the Mike book in 2019. The contract was signed in January. I got the green light around that time and did the very first interview in May of 2019, which was with Steve Kahn, who was one of the charter members of the Brecker brothers. That was a great way to launch into that project, and it led to interviews with Adam Nussbaum and Joey Calderazzo and Jeff Tain Watts and Gene Perla and Richie Byrack and Dave Liebman. And in each case, I was traveling to their homes. Liebman at the time lived in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, and Jeff Tain Watts, I visited him in his glorious big church that he purchased in Easton, Pennsylvania. Adam Nussbaum was living in the Westchester. I visited Susan Brecker at her home in Hastings on Hudson. Randy Brecker out in East Hampton. Gil Goldstein out in the Hamptons. I ended up interviewing 100 people over the course of that year. And then in 2020, I began transcribing those interviews and shaping it into a book. And then bang, here comes the COVID pandemic lockdown. And in a certain way, I barely noticed it because I was locked down anyway, working on this book 8 hours a day through all of 2020, finally delivering the manuscript to the publisher in late December of 2020, spending the first 6 months of this year gathering permissions, photographer permissions, gathering the last minute indicia, putting the book together, including proofing and copy editing and artwork and all that stuff. That was another 6 months. And it's just come out. It came back from the printer. The official release date was October 1st. It's already sold out its first printing. I'm told that the pre-sales alone on Amazon before the book was even available, it went into a second printing already. This is because Mike was not only such a profound and gifted figure, but a beloved figure as well. And this book is my love letter to him. I knew him personally as a friend. I first saw him. I was living in Milwaukee at the time and saw him at Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, which is about, I think, a 50-minute drive from Milwaukee. He was playing there with Joni Mitchell, that Shadows and Light tour band with Pat Metheny, Don Elias on drums, the recently late Lyle Mays on keyboards, and Jaco Pastorius on bass. You dig, what a band. I, of course, had known about Mike and heard the millions of recordings he was on as a session player. Everything from Cameo's Candy to Bruce Springsteen. I mean, he's on so many recordings, 900 sessions. And I knew the Brecker brothers from recordings, but I'd never seen him. And seeing him with Joni Mitchell's group, he had featured performances on Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, incredible, and Free Man in Paris, the Joni tune. On that tune, you hear Mike tapping more into his Junior Walker side of his inspiration, more so than the Train. he had that as well, which came out in so many settings, including the Brecker brothers. This very urgent R&B squealing thing that he did that was so powerful. He kind of balanced those aesthetics: train, searching, um, otherworldly energy, and this urgent, earthy Junior Walker kind of vibe. Um, yeah, Mike, man, so many recordings. Anyway, I saw him with with Joni, and then after moving to New York the next year, I began hanging out at Seventh Avenue South, the club where he and Randy ran that club, owned the club with Kate Greenfield, their partner. She pretty much managed it from day to day, but they were there all the time as well. And I saw Mike play in a number of settings, different Don Grolnick's band and his own group, and Jocko formed the word of mouth band there that was a rotating cast of characters. Mike was on that from time to time. Uh, the group Steps emanated from that place with Mike Menieri and Steve Gadd. Uh, man, it was powerful stuff, and I was hanging out there a lot, so I became really familiar with Mike's playing, uh, both in person and on record. And then, of course, uh, as he joined Steps Ahead, they played gigs at Bottom Line. I remember when Mike formed his band with Adam Nussbaum and Jeff Andrews and Mike Stern and Joey, young, innocent, looked like a teenager, Joey Calderazzo. Their first gig in New York was at Fat Tuesdays, and I was there. And I remember Mike in the throes of his ecstasy, sort of davening with the saxophone on his solos, his head almost scraping the ceiling of Fat Tuesdays. That place had a very low ceiling. It was run by Steve Getz, Stan's son. I lived a few blocks from that place, and I'd be there all the time. So yeah, I got to see Mike play a lot. I finally interviewed him in '82 after he got out of rehab and was about to. He had a new lease on life and was bringing some new energy to the table with his music and his playing, dedicating himself to living a clean and sober life and helping as many other colleagues, friends, and fellow musicians as possible to get on the good foot with that. And he did. I got countless testimony of people who say he literally saved my life. But his first project back after rehab was a challenging and demanding one. Again, he could have put himself into far safer waters, but he dove into the music of Klaus Ogerman with a orchestra, and Klaus Ogerman's, he featured Mike as the voice in this orchestra in the same way that Gil Evans featured Miles as the voice singing the songs on Sketches of Spain or all their collaborations. In fact, Mike got co-billing on that album. Klaus Ogerman, Michael Brecker, ECM album, came out in '82. So I first interviewed Mike to do some press about that project. It was in the Warner Brothers office, I recall, on 53rd Street. Donna Russo, the publicist there, who was great, set up the interview. And it was my first. I had said hi to Mike and encountered him here and there, but this was a sit-down interview for an hour. And I really found him to be almost shy, self-deprecating, which was a quality that so many musicians make reference to in his playing. He was never satisfied, even though he was killing all the time on every solo. Mike was soft-spoken, but very intelligent, very thoughtful. paused a bit before making his answers, and I had a nice rapport with him and had the occasion to interview him several times after and see him in the studio doing that thing where he's doing a take, a solo on somebody else's album, and going after it's over and everybody's jaws are on the ground. Let me try that again. That was terrible. And everybody's like, "What? That was amazing, Mike." No, no. Let me try it again. Going through this process 10 times, leaving the producer with the job of having to figure out which gem to choose from among Mike's many brilliant and takes that were hardly at all related. Yeah, he did that, and I was privy to some of that, and in the course of that, privy to his humor. Those who know his sense of humor, puns, dry, his Jack Benny takes, his Yiddish humor. Oh man, a million and one ways to make you laugh. I got to be friends with him to the point where, you know, we had chats on the phone. I remember him calling me up one day saying, this is when he had his great band with Jeff Tain Watts on drums. And he's like, yeah, Tain can't make this. We got 3 weeks in Europe. Who can I get for a drummer? And I recommended Ralph Peterson. And, you know, he checked him out and was like, wow, yeah. And they went out on tour. It was a beautiful fit. They made some great music together. I guess some of it you can see on YouTube. Man, the stories, I mean, I could go on and on till sunrise about this cat. And the 100 interviews that I did for this book, each one was over an hour, and some were 3 hours. So everyone else could go on and on till sunrise about this cat, about what a sweet and generous spirit he was, what a incredibly dedicated musician he was, what a profound and inspiring figure he was. And, you know, man, I think about these 3 books that I wrote, Pat Martino, Jaco Pastorius, and now Michael Brecker. And it puts me in mind of something, you know, I recently did a Zoom talk with some students from University of Cincinnati, music students. And some were freshmen. They're like 17, 18. Some were seniors. But it put me in mind of our late colleague, Ira Gittler, who was a generation before me. And Ira was on 52nd Street scene and was involved with, you know, Riverside recordings by Monk and Bird. And knowing this guy, in my opinion and the opinion of my colleagues like Jeff Levinson and, you know, Neil Tesser and Kevin Whitehead and so many others my age, we look at that era that Ira was a young man on, was hanging out, was on the scene. And, you know, we say that's when giants walked the earth. You know, Bird, Monk, Train. Ira saw these cats all the time. And now to these young students that I talk to, I was on the scene with giants as well. These giants walked the earth. Pat Martino, Jaco Pastorius, Michael Brecker. You know, and they're looking at me in the way that I looked at Ira. And it's just, it's an honor for me to have been able to tell their stories, really, to immerse myself in their music, to search for testimony, to do a complete and thorough telling of their lives, to try to find out about the people behind the music and put my heart and soul into that effort and do the best I can in bringing their stories in their lives to fruition. And so that's what I've done. That's what I continue to do. And I'm happy to share these stories with you. I have no idea how long I've been talking. I need a glass of water over here. But thank you, Gail, for allowing me to ramble. I could go on till sunrise. Maybe I should talk about my other book about Keith Richards that I did. Oh, that's the phone telling me to stop. Maybe I should talk about my book, Swinging, about Cab Calloway and those cats. Okay, I gotta go.